they ended up, half the program said one, half the other. We got the panels backwards. So we're going to talk about writing for animation for a while here, and at some point we'll segue to Hanna-Barbera. So don't think of this as two 1-hour panels, think of it as 1 2-hour panel, and just leave whenever you feel like it and such. Thank you. My name is Mark Evanier. This is Brynne Chandler. That's Paul Dini. That's John Semper, and that's Mr. Greg Gargoyles. Greg is one of the great authorities on cartoon music. He's written some cartoon stuff himself also. And he's got a book out, he'll probably tell you. Do you got a copy of the book here?
I have a copy, and I also have Shameless. This is that, and I have if anybody wants to leaf through the book, I've got that.
Anyway, he's got a book on the history of Hanna-Barbera music.
Many folks here have been on this.
Can you hear Greg back there? Okay, great. Anyway, we're going to all just talk about stuff here, and a lot of what happens here will be driven by whatever questions you ask us. I have found that whenever I do the writing for animation panels, I poll the room and ask, how many people here would like to, I want to ask, how many people want us to talk about how to get a job in animation, how many people want us to talk about how to write a script for animation? And every single room is 50-50. So we'll talk about both topics, such. Let me run down the panel here and have each member of the panel tell us a little bit about what they've done. Brynne, you want to run down your resume for these people? I don't mean to run it down, I mean just talk about, she's done an amazing list of shows.
The very first show I sold a script to was the original He-Man and Masters of the Universe. The very last show that I did was actually with John Semper. I can say it now.
Yeah, you can.
We did a show called Weather Hunters for Al Weatherman and Al Roker. In between, I did Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I story edited Batman the Animated Series. I story edited Disney's Gargoyles. And I wrote 2 episodes of my favorite all-time show, Potato Head Kids. That's it.
Paul?
Well, let's see, I started at Filmation Studios around 1980 and wrote just about everything they did there. Whether it was Flash Gordon or Fat Albert or whatever, then I got to work with Brynne and Michael Reeves on He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And then went to Hanna-Barbera, Everybody Spears, worked on a variety of Saturday morning shows. Moved up to the Bay Area.
You can't say a variety of shows, you have to give us some names.
Okay. Dragon's Lair, Mr. T, the Gary Coleman Show. Oh, you're forcing me back there. Scooby-Doo, everybody you have to work on Scooby-Doo at some point in your career. Then I went to work at Lucasfilm on the Ewoks and Droids cartoon. Then for Warner Brothers, worked on Tiny Toons, Animaniacs, Batman the Animated Series, Freakazoid, Superman, several iterations of Justice League, and again, back to Scooby-Doo. So, there you go.
John?
Circle.
Yeah.
I hate to have to follow Dini on this. I started out writing Scooby-Doo, and then I was on staff at Hanna-Barbera, so I wrote everything that was going on at that time, which was things like Biscuits and Smurfs and Little Rascals, animated Little Rascals, and I don't know, everything that was going on at that particular moment. Then I segued over to Marvel Productions, where I worked on, I started showrunning for the first time. I did a show called Moon Dreamers, which was part of My Little Pony. And then I was a showrunner for Jim Henson's animated Fraggle Rock, which was just heaven, because I got to work with Jim Henson personally. And then some other stuff happened. I don't know, I remember doing Bionic 6. And then eventually I ended up, the thing I'm best known for is Spider-Man the Animated Series. You all get your checks. I haven't done that. And then, good Lord, after that, I did Static Shock Shock. I worked on Static Shock. And, in fact, my office was right next to Paul's.
That's right.
We had offices next to one another. And Bruce Timm was right down at the end of the lane. And then some other stuff happened, and there's some other stuff in the middle. I did a preschool series called JJ the Jet Plane. I think I left out Super Friends. I did Super Friends. And then ultimately, the thing I'm doing right now, I'm just finishing up 2 years on a show where I'm an exec producer and head writer for Al Roker on his new show, Weather Hunters, which is for PBS. And I think that's sort of it. And then I might remember some other stuff and interrupt other people and say, oh, I did this and I did that. But anyway, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, Greg, you want to plug the book more? Or?
Well, the book took 5 years to write and a lifetime to absorb because I've loved Hanna-Barbera since I was a kid, and I've loved their records since I was a kid. So the book combines both. I've actually written for a Hanna-Barbera read-along product. It was the read-along for Viva Rock Vegas, which actually is a Disney product, even though it was Universal and Hanna-Barbera, and it's the only Disney recording that has a Hanna-Barbera sound effect on it. So that's kind of cool. I've written a lot of, a bunch of books. Mousetrack's a story of Walt Disney Records, various essays like a cartoon music book, and edited the autobiography of the guy who founded the record company, publishing, direct marketing. It was his idea to put those books in the slipcovers. And I've written for Archie, so much fun. Written for Disney Comics, written for many different comic companies, and lots of children's books. Also for the Tom and Jerry show that Renegade produced a while ago, and spent several decades at Disney, pretty much doing thousands of different kinds of advertising for TV and for radio and some TV specials. And also, I'm a nuclear physicist, and I fold each bag. And if you get that joke, thank you. It's an SNL joke.
All right, now I will tell you my resume, I'll tell you a little story to lead into it. I started out writing comic books for Gold Key and for Disney and all those companies, and I'm apprenticed with this guy. Some of you may have heard of him, Jack Kirby. And I started writing live-action television for a while, and Hanna-Barbera first hired me to write a live-action pilot. I wrote a pilot for Hanna-Barbera that none of you has ever seen. It was a sitcom pilot about 3 girls in bikinis who live on the beach and wear bikinis a lot and dance a lot. And it was a lot more fun to cast that show than it was to watch it. And while I was doing that, I was saying to Joe Barbera, I kept saying to Joe, you know, I wrote the Scooby-Doo comic book for several years. Could I write the TV show? And he said, oh, live action writers can't write animation. And then I was made the head of the Hanna-Barbera comic book division. I was running all their comic books for there. And every time I'd see Joe Barbera in the halls, I'd say, you know, I'd like to be writing cartoons. He'd say, no, you're a live action writer. Live action writers can't write cartoons. So the first job I got writing for Saturday Morning was for Sid and Marty Krofft on a live action show. And one of the producers of that recommended me to the studio called Ruby Spears, and I started writing the ABC Weekend Specials for them, and I wrote Plastic Man, and I wrote Thunder the Barbarian, and a bunch of other shows for Ruby Spears. And one day, Hanna-Barbera was having a problem because ABC didn't want to pick up another season of Scooby-Doo. And they said, you know, the show's all worn out. Scooby-Doo's through, he's washed up. This is like 1980. They figured Scooby-Doo was over. And Joe Barbera said, I've got this idea for a new character. We're going to add you with a version of a character named Scrappy Doo. So they wrote, various people at Hanna-Barbera wrote pilots for Scrappy Doo and scripts for this. ABC kept saying, this isn't working. This isn't right. Hey, there's a writer who's writing some stuff for us for Ruby Spears. Why don't you hire him to write this? His name's Mark Evanier. So I got a call one day from Joe Barbera saying, why didn't you tell me you could write cartoons? And I wrote the pilot that that's picked up Scooby-Doo I wrote the first Scrappy-Doo episode and picked up, I didn't create the character, I just wrote a pilot that showed how he worked. And then I worked for Hamburger, Richie Rich. I worked for just every studio in town. I worked for Marvel Productions. I started a show there called Dungeons and Dragons. I had to sue them. I worked for Deke on a couple of shows. I took my name off those, but I had to sue them. I worked for Ruby Spears. I worked for Filmation. I wrote one pilot that they bought the show, and then you worked on that show, Paul. Paul ended up taking over that show. I wrote the pilot, and they said, the network said, we'll buy this. And Lou Scheimer said, I hate it, let's rewrite it all.
Which one was that?
It was Black Star.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I got out of the cartoon business kind of for a while, because I run out of studios to either work for or sue. And CBS had me writing a Michael Jackson cartoon show. I also wrote The Wuzzles for Disney. And I was working on this Michael Jackson cartoon show. It wasn't working out. So I went to CBS and said, I am moonwalking off this show. I don't want anything to do with it. They said, well, how about if you write Garfield instead? So I wrote every Garfield cartoon for the next 22 years. And a couple of other shows, I made a show that nobody in this room remembers called Channel Umpty 3. I wrote a show that a lot of people don't remember called Mother Goose and Grimm for CBS, and all sorts of other silly things. Now, that's how I got into the business. It's a unique circumstance. It doesn't really apply today. There's nothing in that story that you can use to help out your career, except to understand that it's possible to be typed in this business. They don't want to usually hire you to do something you haven't done before. So people wouldn't hire me to write cartoons because I thought I was a live action writer. Later on, some people wouldn't hire me for live action shows because they thought I was a cartoon writer. There was a point when I was at Hanna-Barbera, I was storytelling Richie Rich, and a man named Doug Wildey came on. Doug Wildey was the creator of Johnny Quest, you may know his name. And he came to me and said, Mark, I'm doing the Godzilla show. We want you to write some episodes of this. And I said, oh, sure, how do we start? He said, let me just call NBC and get you approved for this. And he comes in 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, and says, oh, they won't approve you to write Godzilla. They think you're a funny writer, so we want you to write the Flintstone show they're doing. So I go down the hall and talk to Bob Local about writing one of those. Went down the hall and talked to Bob Local. He said, oh, that's great, but I want you to do this. Let me just call over to NBC and get you approved for this. And he comes into my office later and says, they say they don't want you writing Flintstones because you're a superhero adventure writer. And so I looked on neither show. This will happen to you at some point in the business. Let's go down here and could we hear some stories about how you got your first break in animation?
Well, like so many other people writing animation during the 80s and 90s, I got my break from Michael Reeves. He got a phone call one day from Arthur Nadell, who said, hi, we're starting this new series called He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Do you want to write for it? And Michael said, who is this really, and what do you want? But it was a true thing happening, and I had never written a word before then, had moved in with Michael about 2 weeks earlier to try to be some kind of writer in Hollywood. Arthur said, if you'll write a spec script and you get it done by Friday at 5, I will read it. This was Wednesday at about 3 in the afternoon. So Michael used to get his scripts bound once the shows were produced. So I grabbed a bunch of those books, sat down at my little Apple computer, and would run into the other room and ask Michael, how do you say it when a spaceship goes like this? And this was so long ago that the answer was Xeroxes through shot. So I spent 2 16-hour sessions with about 2 hours sleep in between writing a spec script for He-Man, tried to print it out on my IBM Selectronic, and it wouldn't. So we put the whole computer in the car, drove to North Hollywood where Diane Duane lived, some of you may know her name, and she got it to print out, brought it to Arthur, he looked at it, dropped it on the floor and said thanks. So Monday morning, I got the best compliment, second best compliment I've ever gotten in my life. Arthur called at 9:30 Monday morning and said to Michael, "Tell me the truth, did you write this?" And I had done it all myself with his help and just reading shot descriptions, and back then, you had to call everything. Every single move. There were no master shots in animation. A script was 45 pages. It took 2 double-sided, double-density, 8-inch floppies to store one. But Arthur bought that script. It was chosen to be part of Man's Chinese premiere of He-Man, which was cool. They didn't sit me with A-listers. They sat the writers with the staff and their families, so I got to see my first ever script on the big screen with a bunch of little kids on the lap. So I highly recommend it, because when a joke does not land in a theater full of 8-year-olds, it really doesn't land. So after that, Arthur kept hiring me, and he took me in to meet Lou Scheimer, and Lou Scheimer said, "The thing that really gets me about you is that you knew Xerox's through shot your first time." So learn your craft. That's my big advice, is learn your craft. So that's how I got in, and then people just kept hiring me.
Yeah, mine is very similar, that it begins with filmation. Slightly different entry into it though. My father was a singer in Boston, and he knew some local folks, including a guy he'd gone into the Army with, whose name was John Cactus, who was a really good composer. He's my godfather, and he did a lot of TV movies, he did a lot of movie scores. They were very close from the Army days. And they had a mutual friend from Boston named Norm Prescott, who was a DJ around that time. And my dad, like I said, was a singer, so Norm knew that he was a local boy singer and played his stuff. So somehow they were all talking in the late 70s and early 80s, and my name came up, like, "What's your kid doing?" He's finishing up college in Boston. And I was drawing cartoons for my school newspaper, just crazy little comic strips with my own characters in them. And Norm said to both John and my dad, "Oh, we're always looking for people, so have them send his stuff into the studio," which was nice. So I sent in a bunch of my comic strips, which were absolutely the wrong quality for animation, even filmation. They were just way too crude for getting on TV. But he liked the writing. He said, "The gags are good. Tell him if he wants to try some script writing. This is what we have coming up this year. We're doing Tom and Jerry and Heckle and Jekyll, and we have Fat Albert, and if he wants to write something, come up with some gags." So I did, and I wrote it. I knew all those characters. I knew who Mighty Mouse was. I knew they were doing Tom and Jerry the year after that. So I wrote some stuff as a way of getting in. He said, "Great, come on in. I think we can use you." So I came in and I learned how to write everything. I learned how to deal with the storyboard artists and get input from them for the funny stuff, and then everything they were doing in action adventure at the time, like Flash Gordon and things like Tarzan, things like that. There was an open assignment, I got it, and I learned how to write and write fast, and I skewed more toward the funny stuff, but I like the action adventure also. So I worked there for about 8 months, and they went through a normal layoff time. They would have like summer layoffs where the shows were done, and then they were waiting to hear if they'd be picked up for shows, and then usually midsummer they'd find out if they were going to get another order or not. So I went back to Boston for about a year, and then when I came back out again, the stuff that I'd written was on TV, and they had liked it, so Norm and Lou asked me to come back and work with you and Michael and Art Nadell and Larry DiTilio and Masters of the Universe. And so that was fun, and from there I went over to Ruby Spears and freelanced for Hanna-Barbera and just worked in just about every studio in town. And then I got a call to go to Lucasfilm and work on adapting the Ewoks and the Droids into a Saturday morning series in the mid-80s, and that was really the start of it.
Well, it's a small world, because when Paul was in college at Emerson,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, I was probably wandering around Boston as well. We're both from Boston. And if you had come to the Western Cinema, you probably passed by me where I sold them popcorn or something.
Frequently.
I was managing, I was assistant manager of the Orson Welles Cinema. Be that as it may. I came out here, to sort of seek fame and fortune, but I had a pretty good skill, which was being able to film edit. I was very interested in film editing and post-production. And initially, I worked for a guy that I worked for in Boston, who was a producer. He hired me out here. He was doing a survey of the animation business for an investment counseling firm, and he knew that I knew a lot about animation. So when he found out that I was interested in coming out to LA, he said, well, if you come to LA, I'll give you a gig. And literally within days of coming to Los Angeles, I was in a room with Chuck Jones, and we were at Disney meeting the then head of animation at Disney, is a fellow named Donald Duckwall, if you can believe that. And I was meeting with Fritz Freeling and every animation studio. Literally within the first week of coming out here, because of this study, this survey that this producer was doing, we were meeting all the heads of all the animation studios. They invited me to a recording session for Flintstones. That was when most of the original cast was still doing it. And Mel Blanc was still doing Barney Rubble. And that was just like going to heaven. Anyway, during the course of that, we interviewed Lou Scheimer, and we interviewed Joe Ruby and Ken Spears. And when the survey was done, I thought I'm going to go to the guys that I felt that I had sort of had a good connection with. So I went to Lou Scheimer, the head of Filmation, one of the heads of Filmation. And he took me around and I said, I want to write. And he said, well, only special people get to write. But he said, what else are you interested in? He said, how would you like to be a storyboard artist? And I said, well, I can draw a little bit. I actually got a degree in visual and environmental studies, and so I ostensibly started to train as a storyboard artist at Filmation. But they had me working with a guy named Bob Klein, who was literally the Michelangelo of storyboard artists. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. This is, I'm not that good. And so I thought, well, the other guys that I had a good affinity with were Joe Ruby and Ken Spears. So I went to see them. Joe Ruby looked at me as if somehow I was a corporate spy and I was trying to infiltrate his studio. He wanted nothing to do with me. But Ken Spears, bless his heart, he said, well, John, he was a very kind of avuncular kind of guy, and I really liked him a lot. He said, well, John, what do you want to do? And as I had already bombed out on the asking about writing side of things, I said, well, how about, I'd like to work in your editorial department. And he said, well, okay, I'll line you up with an interview. And long story short, I did get a job working for Ruby Spears in editorial, and that's why I'm wearing this shirt. Because this shirt, someone in China has made a shirt with all the Ruby Spears characters that I edited on when I first started. This was the Mighty Man in Yuck era, and the Plastic Man, and Rickety Rocket. I worked on all those shows as an editorial person. And the great thing about doing that was that you really learned how cartoons were constructed for Saturday morning. They laid us off at Ruby Spears, and a whole bunch of us in editorial segued over to Hanna-Barbera, and now I was working in editorial at Hanna-Barbera, which was really a dream come true. And I had a very unique position, which was that when the shows would come in from overseas, I would chop out all the bad bits and put them all together, and then sit with the producers, and we'd look them over and figure out what needed to have retakes. And so I got to know all the producers really well. I was sitting with Alex Lovey, and I was sitting with Art Scott, and all the guys that were producing at that time, editing on all the shows that were being done. I actually edited on the pilot for Smurfs. And my first screen credit for Hanna-Barbera was as a post-production person on Laverne and Shirley in the Army, and Fonz and Foxy, Fonz and the Happy Days Gang in outer space, or whatever the hell they were doing. So those were my first Hanna-Barbera credits. During that time, I'm going to try to make this real short, I met a lovely young lady named Cynthia Friedlow. She was working in the music department at the time, and then actually up in the executive offices. And I had taken a class that Harry Love taught Harry Love was an old animator guy that was employed at Hanna-Barbera in an executive position. And he was going to teach a whole new crop of young writers how to write animation. And I had taken that class, and I had actually gotten a pretty good grade at the end of that class. But that was not, strangely enough, my way into writing for Hanna-Barbera. Cynthia at Hanna-Barbera was going to be laid off in the executive level. And Margaret Lesh, the legendary Margaret Lesh, who was Cynthia's immediate boss, Margaret didn't like to fire people. So Margaret would say, I've got great news for you. You're no longer going to be working in this department. I'm going to let you be a writer. And Cynthia came to me one day and she said, well, I've got bad news. I'm being laid off. And I said, really? She laid you off? And she said, well, no, she's going to make me a writer, but I don't want to do that. And I said, well, you know what? And this was really just about staying employed. I said, well, I know how these cartoons are written because I've edited so many of them. And it's something that I kind of want to do. So let's just call ourselves a writing team, because at that particular moment we were a couple. And I'll handle the majority of the writing. I know what to do. So go back and tell Margaret that you'll do it. So she went back, she told Margaret, okay, we'll write. And in that first year we sold something like 4 Scooby-Doos, which was unheard of at that time. And I was freelancing. I was working at an editorial at Universal. I was working on a movie called DC Cab with Mr. T. And that's my first movie credit as the apprentice editor on DC Cab. And I would come home at night really tired, and I would handwrite out all my Hanna-Barbera stuff. And then Cynthia would type it up, because there were no word processors back then. We had only just graduated from Chisel and Stone. And so we started selling a lot. And finally the network said, well, who are John and Cynthia? We like what they were doing. This was ABC. And Margaret thought, well, maybe I should get these two on staff. And so I left editing. We were kind of in the middle of BC Cab when I resigned from that, and I came over to staff at Hanna-Barbera. And that's really how it started. And then when Margaret left Hanna-Barbera, she brought us over to Marvel with her, because by then we were doing quite well, and we had sold a lot, and we had written a whole bunch of shows. And the way that we worked was that I was sort of the writer guy, and Cynthia would kind of be the best editor and the typist, and she was a great person to bounce ideas off of. But that's how it started for me. So these are all my Ruby Spears characters today.
I wrote a bunch of those Ruby Spears characters. Yeah, I wrote the Rickety Rocket.
Yeah, well, there's Ricky Rocket's in here somewhere, right there.
And probably almost every character on that shirt was designed by the late Jerry Eisner.
Right.
Right.
Great producers and talented men.
I'm only just
Yes. Great, get us.
I have the Fang Face album. I have tons of Masters of the Universe LPs, including the soundtrack, The Secret of the Sword, which I wrote about on Jerry's cartoon. And I have the Beach Girls soundtrack album, which you mentioned at the beginning. But that's not the show, that's the motion picture.
No,
Yeah.
that's no relation.
Yeah, that's why it's not in the book, but it's a nice cover. That's not a bad album. Anyway, I think one of the things that is common here is that there's no one path. There's never one path. And in my case, because I've written for so many different companies and for so many different kinds of stuff, every one of them is a path. And one piece of, one saying that I love to repeat that I actually got from Katie Lee, who was on our Comic-Con panel. She said, make a friend, be a friend. And it's not like, oh, be my best friend, and force it. It just sort of happens, but then if that miracle does happen, and it helps to be in a vicinity where that can happen, and because you bloom where you plant it, then you nurture that. And you don't make it about, can I do this, can I do that? You just get to know the people, and then there's this tendency to be like, well, I know what this person can do, let me give them a call. Or you do ask, but you don't like immediately, but you do ask, well, what do you think? And the way it happened with Tom and Jerry, there isn't, was, believe it or not, my road to Tom and Jerry started with the Mousetraps book, which is about Disney Records, the Disney Records division from '56 to 1988, the LPs. And Tim Hollis, who wrote it with me, and he's a great pop culture writer. This was my favorite book. He's part of a complete breakfast about all the serial characters. Tim and I both interviewed a lady named Laura Olsher. Now, she did voices for the Patty Freeling, and she did most famously in Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, she was Mrs. Cratchit. It was a founder of the feast indeed. I wish I had you here and I would give peace of my mind to feast upon. Well, she did a very famous and highly profitable album for Disney called Chilling Thrilling Sounds of the Haunted House. Disney made a fortune on that album because it was all sound effects which are non-licensed, even though they were their property. But they got it from other places too, and there was no music, and there was just a narrator. Laura Olsher came in to do a different album, because she did about 4 or 5 for them in the early 60s. This came out around 63, before The Haunted Mansion, has nothing to do with it. And she was doing another album, and they handed her a script that was like, 100 words. Could you just read this off? And it began with, and if you heard this album, you are a bold and courageous person, afraid of nothing. With the haunted house, and then you hear the sound effects. We had to interview this lady, and she was the scariest person. She was scarier than the album. She was and she had just had a stroke, and she was bitter and angry, and how she was cheated on all these things. And I sent her an album of Learning to Tell Time is Fun that hopefully appease her. Never heard back. I think I talked to her twice, and it was, how some people, it's just you can't ever say the right thing. And so I talked to Tim, and he said, I had the same thing happen. Well, Daryl Van Sitters, who I had met at a Disneyana convention where I was presenting about Disney music, and he was there, between him and Tim, we became this triangle of people telling Laura Olsher horror stories. And so I got to know Daryl, and he's a sweetheart. Now, Daryl Van Sitters is legendary. He did the original Roger Rabbit idea and all that stuff, and he founded Renegade, and he directed the Showbiz Bunny, I believe it was, for Warner, and a nice guy. And so we just talked here and there, and then we started having breakfast, and he was doing various things, and he was doing Tom and Jerry, and I said, how do can I do some? And he introduced me to Will Finn, who was the story editor, and that's kind of where that happened. And it wasn't any easier, because writing for Tom and Jerry is almost exactly like writing for Archie. When you get the assignment, great, because you'll know just what the characters do because you know them so well. Betty and Veronica talk in my head, and Archie and Red, you know them. So that's the easy part, writing it. But selling an idea when there are thousands of Archie comics and hundreds of Tom and Jerry cartoons, they've done that. Plus you've got other writers, and so it's like they put it in a big hopper and they pull the name out, this one did this. So it was very hard to not repeat something that was done. The other thing, and this is a Filmation thing, is you have to know, like that thing you said about the Xerox, you have to write to what their technological and budgetary limits are. And the cool thing about Filmation to me is their system was so unique, because you had to write, you go through the stock and you get the ideas from the stock, and maybe 20% was new. And
their budget was insanely tight. So I remember you couldn't have anyone stand up or sit down. You couldn't have anyone enter or leave the room. You couldn't have really any gestures, and I know they're infamous for framing people like this so they didn't have to animate their mouths.
Yeah.
So you put people in 3/4 profile. And I once asked Arthur Maydell, well, if I'm gonna use stock footage, why don't you show me a stock book? And he laughed, and he had Bob Klein come down and get me, and they took me upstairs, and it was a library of white binders that were all stock stuff. But once you knew what they wanted and how to do it, you could almost do no wrong.
And the cool thing about it is, despite the limitations, they're darn good. No, they're good. And it's largely due to the voice work, the sound, music, but also the writing.
And also the subject matter.
Yeah,
Because Filmation was really cool about the,
Yeah.
about the properties that they licensed. They did Star Trek.
yeah,
And they always approach things, I still maintain, I was talking to somebody recently, we maintain that the best Tarzan that's ever been brought to the screen was Filmation's Tarzan.
yeah.
Because they went directly to the source material and they didn't mess around with it. So the purest Edgar Rice Burroughs that you're going to see on screen will be that Filmation Tarzan show.
Yeah. One of the coolest things about writing in the 80s and 90s is that I saw animation go from Filmation filming like this so they didn't have to show the mouths to being able to write in a Gargoyles script, Goliath looks puzzled. And because you couldn't do that in the early 80s, you couldn't call for facial expressions in animation because they'd either ignore you or what would come out would be so horrifying that it wasn't worth it. And then by the time I got to Disney, I could say, Goliath looks puzzled, and he would. They actually would do it that way.
Now, you've heard here a lot of stories that, as Greg pointed out, don't really give you a role model to follow, because everybody's story is different. But there's a certain commonality there, because in every case, one of us had an opportunity, we had a connection somehow to submit something, and there was a void here, they needed something. An awful lot of writers, people trying to get into animation, spend a lot of time trying to submit to shows that aren't buying. Because by the time you see a show on the air, it may be over with. There's a huge lead time in doing animation, and the network will order 13 episodes, or a syndicator will order 26. And by the time you see the show, they've done the 26, they're not doing anymore, and you're writing a spec script or submitting no place. There was when I was at Hanna-Barbera, there was a room full of spec scripts which people had submitted for shows that were all defunct by the time those scripts showed up. The trick here is to make those connections, and every story is different of how you make a connection and find out what show is looking for people and such, or meet someone who is in a position to show your work to the next step up the ladder, and then be able to deliver something that they will feel is useful. I find that the word useful is very useful, because some people want to talk about, oh, my script was great, oh, my script was wonderful, oh, my script was terrific. Well, okay, it may have been all those things, but to be purchased, to have you be paid, it has to be useful. It has to advance a project somehow and get it to the next step, whatever it is. They're looking for scripts that take the show in this direction. If you take the show in the other direction, they don't need it. And the other thing that's interesting is that there are a lot of differences between writing live action and animation. If you were in a live action, writing a live action TV show for syndication, let's say, and you write down the entire world explodes and you see all the buildings in flames, that's going to cost a little money to do. In animation, it costs about the same as having somebody just run madly across the screen. So you have to learn the technical end of animation and what is possible and what isn't possible. You have to learn that in many cases you're looking for a studio that's not going to put a lot of animation on the screen. Therefore, you have to kind of make do with make the voice work, the scripts and the voice, and give the actors something which they can play, which will make up for the fact that the animation is not very expressive. See any J. Ward or early Hanna-Barbera cartoon, for an example. Hanna-Barbera built their studio largely on the talents of a man named Dawes Butler, who for my money was the greatest voice actor ever in television animation, because his characters were his voice was so animated, even if Yogi Bear wasn't. And you also have to understand the needs of the job. You have to understand, everyone here has a story about the impossible deadline. We have to write something. I wrote the pilot for Dungeons and Dragons in 2 days, and which is all they had. They actually said, they called me and they said, Tuesday, they said, we need you to write this pilot. I said, can I have till next week? And they said, Mark, if we had till next week, we'd have called you Friday. And it is very important early on to develop a reputation for being fast and for being reliable. This happens a lot. Everybody's got a story here, and we won't go through all of these, but we've all got a story about anytime they came to you and they were desperate. We need a show. We've got their actors booked for next Tuesday. We don't have a script to record. What can you give us that is good enough for us to record? We all have stories about working with standards and practices people, which are no longer that applicable. You write cartoons these days, you don't have as much problem with somebody's, I'm saying on page 14, the character is not allowed to be mean that way. And I'm going to turn this over to questions from the floor, but I want to just ask everybody briefly before we get to that. Tell us about, just name for me, each of you, a show that came out pretty much the way you wanted it to. Not 100%, but you could say, if that show wasn't any good, I take a lot of the blame, because they animated the show I wrote, they did it pretty much the way I wanted.
Pretty much almost everything I wrote, which is why people used to ask me all the time, with your connections, why didn't you ever get into sitcoms? Why didn't you ever get into movies? Why didn't you try? Why should I? To write animation, I would sit home with my kids, have a glass of wine, type out a script, hand it in, and they animated it. It was not really an issue. In movies, you have to listen to 800 people say no, and then maybe never get to the one who says yes. And in sitcoms, you're going to be in a writer's room, which is my idea of a nightmare. If I want to be talked over and interrupted and ignored, I got lots of guys I can go out to lunch with. It's nicer when you get paid for it, but not really. Not really.
Let's talk over. Paul, initially you thought came up.
But wait, I didn't finish. Batman the Animated Series, though. Batman the Animated Series, I pretty much could guarantee that it was going to be animated exactly the way I wanted, and every episode is amazing.
Yeah, I'd say Batman as well. I would also follow it up with Duck Dodgers, which was last series that I did at Warner's, and it was a nightmare getting them to greenlight the show because they were going to do it as a movie, then direct to video, and there was a whole reel, little bits of fragments which show up in the title sequence of how gorgeous the animation was going to look for the Duck Dodgers feature. So some of it was incorporated here and there. But once the show was greenlit, once we were up and running, it was a dream. It was so much fun doing that show. It was, I worked writing with Tony and Spike and Tom Minton, and we were able to bring in the actors we wanted. We were able to get guest stars we never thought we'd get. And it was terrific. And before the third season, I got the offer to go develop and work on Lost. And I did that. And then and within 2 weeks, I was going like, God, I want to get back on Duck Dodgers. It's the writers room. The writers room. I mean, there are some very gifted, wonderful people in the writers room, particularly that one. But it's like, what are we doing? We never had any idea. It's just, I miss Marvin and Marshall.
I think the nightmare for a lot of us is working in a writer's room. I've never wanted to work in a writer's room. And the whole concept just makes me ill. It's just a bunch of people shouting at one another and trying to one-up one another, and it's not my idea of a good time. Some people live for it. For me, it would obviously have to be Spider-Man, the animated series. The funny thing was with Spider-Man, it was a nightmare in the beginning because everybody hated everybody. And there's some people involved in that show that I still hate to this very day. And so it was just fights, it's just everybody getting in a room and battling it out and egos. And I thought, if I could just stick this out, we had 65 half hours to do. And we're on, half hour 1 or 2, and there's all this fighting going on. And I thought, if I can just stick this out, eventually, because none of these people are writers, they're all just going to go away. They're just going to get tired and they're going to go away. And I would say, I did an interview recently where somebody said, the first 13 episodes of Spider-Man are like, it's a good show, not a great show, he said, but after the first 13, man, the show really takes off. And that's because after the first 13, a lot of those people went away. Actually, what they did is they all moved into the editing room because we started getting footage in. The cool thing about, or the interesting thing about animation is you write something and then 9 months later you see it. So we wrote the entire first 13 episodes of Spider-Man without seeing a single bit of footage. And then the footage started coming in. They all moved into the editing room to harass our poor editor, Richard Arnold. Can't remember Richard's name right now. And then they left me alone. Then it was sort of like, well, we've taught him how we want the show to be written. So now he can go off and do what we've told him to do. And I just rubbed my hands with glee and I thought, good, now I can make the show my own. And from episode 14 on, really from Day of the Chameleon on, it's really the show that I always wanted it to be. The first bunch are just sort of Spider-Man and Villain over and over and over again. But then we started doing the more complicated stories. So for me, it's Spider-Man. I see more of myself in Spider-Man than many of the other things that I've done. Brynne was involved in Spider-Man.
I was going to ask you what was I in those first 13?
I don't remember, to be honest with you.
Because I was in a room with a lot of people who hated each
You were at the very beginning. At one point, Avi Arad was totally convinced, this is totally off topic, Mark, I'm sorry. Avi Arad was totally convinced that the only person who could write Spider-Man was Brynne. And that was that particular week that he was wanting to get me fired. But it's all water under the bridge. By the time we got to the end of Spider-Man, I was working up to it almost completely alone. The network stopped calling altogether. Sydney I Wonder had left the show and then turned it over to David McDermott, and David never called me. And Avi had gone because he was off trying to get movies made, and Stan had quit the show after the first 13. He didn't want to be bothered. Bless his heart, I love Stan. And so it was just me. And I was just saying to my friend Karen the other day, that's how you got the Spider-Verse. Because when I came up with the Spider-Verse, I could just do it. I didn't have to go to anyone and say, I want to do this thing with multiple Spider-Man and different dimensions. And if I had to do that, they would have said no. And instead, it was my final 3 episodes of my series. No one was bothering me. I did this thing that is now called the Spider-Verse. So that's to answer your question, to be Spider-Man. Oh, and also the pilot for my new show, which is called Weather Hunters, which will be on PBS in July. I wrote the pilot, and it actually came out pretty much the way I wanted it to, so I'm very happy with that. So.
There's something really wonderful about that kind of situation, and it's really rare. I mean, I loved working on Tom and Jerry, and what a cool, also, they were overseas first, and then you gotta find them, and then it's like, oh, there it is. And I've written quite a few things for overseas that I know the scripts were fun, but I don't really know how they came out. And I've also written things for Disney Imagineering that I can't even tell you because it was internal, you know. And I've written TV, you know those big parades on Christmas that Disney does? You know, somebody writes those. I mean, they wing it a bit, but you're giving them points, and then some of the throws are scripted. So they have books behind that little those flowers, there are books. Somebody writes it. But I think if I had to compare it to something, when I look back on the happiest, every second of this was happy. At Disney, they asked us to make a video we basically ripped off David Letterman with the dog cam. They said do something, well, I won't go into all the details, but we ended up doing a kid cam, and you didn't see the kid. We actually had Frank Newman do the voice of the kid in the first one. We had 2 zany parents who were really good improv actors, because the parks are loaded with talented people, equity people, and we gave them some lines, we gave them go do this, and it was glorious. And we made 1 that was internal, and then 2 that were this is before YouTube had viral stuff. So they had it on their website, their blog site. We did 1 for Epcot, 1 for Magic Kingdom. 1 had to stress nutrition. It was the whole idea is take your babies. Don't wait till they're old enough to understand anything. Take your babies. You know, we want to widen that market. So, and we had to give kids a reason to go to Epcot because people thought it was boring. Actually, it's not boring for kids, but we had to prove that. So we just went nuts. We just went nuts. I mean, they had to approve the scenarios, but when we got out there, it was just us. And I've been in meetings where my work is looked at by at least 50 people around the big table. And it has to go all around, and everybody has to, or worked on big commercials, national commercials, where everybody has to look through the viewfinder. One time, it was so overmanaged that they canceled the commercial because they couldn't even make it. But that was glorious. So I know that's not an animated, it sort of is, it has a Mickey Mouse in it, but you can see 2 of those. It's called Little Timmy. Little Timmy goes to Epcot, Little Timmy goes to Magic Kingdom, and they're just little short things, and they're little gems.
Can I give you one piece of advice in animation in particular, but just advice as a writer, that if I'm going to attend a panel like this, it's the most important thing. You have to understand, you're probably not going to be able to run a show right off the bat, so let's just assume that you're going to come in and you're looking for an opportunity to write. Running a show is hell. It's war, okay? I think we can all agree on this. You know, I know you all think...
Mark disagrees.
Mark disagrees, okay. I know you all think that it would be great if you could run your favorite show with your favorite character and, oh, you do wonderful things. But the fact of the matter is, more often than not, there's a whole huge amount of politics involved, and you're working with all kinds of different personalities, and everybody wants to have their say. And so it's very political. You have to have good diplomatic skills. That's for running a show. If you come to write a show, you're going to be working with someone who's running a show, and more often than not, they're going to be going through hell. So on one end, they have the people that they're working for, and on the other end, they have you. If you are not flexible, if you are not agreeable, if you are not willing to put your ego to one side and just do what you're told, you are going to create the hard place that the story editor is going to find himself between the hard place and the rock. And if you are the hard place, you are probably not going to get hired again. But if you are amiable and easy to work with and fun to work with, and you take direction well, you're not being hired to be a creative genius, you're being hired to fulfill a need, as has already been said here. And if you fulfill the need really well, like the people that I hired a lot of new people, many of whom have since gone on to have really great careers. I hired, for instance, Jim Freed, who has gone on to produce all the wonderful Warner Brothers animated films. I hired Ernie Alpacker. I gave them their first gigs. I didn't hire them because I thought they were insanely talented. I hired them because I thought they were really good guys and they were easy to work with. And so being a really good, amiable person is more important than being a great creative genius at the very beginning. That's the one most valuable piece of advice I can give anybody wanting to write in animation for television.
To add to that, to go back to what I said before, this is why you have to know your craft. You have to know it inside and out. If you take notes from your friends or from your mom or from your writing group, these are all valuable and good, but it's an entirely different emotional experience to take notes from people who control your paycheck. And you also, because they know they control your paycheck, you cannot just say, I want to do it this way because I think it works better. No, you have to be able to say, I understand you don't like this scene in Act 1, but if you take it out, then it messes up the setup in Act 2, which is what spurs the climax in Act 3. So if you pull this scene, the whole script falls apart, the story doesn't make sense, and we have to do another whole rewrite. And there's no time for that. As far as being amiable and good, the only thing that can balance not being amiable is knowing your craft inside and out. My late ex-husband, Michael Reeves, was probably one of the most difficult human beings to work with on the planet, but he had over 500 scripts, an Emmy nomination, a Writers Guild nomination, because even though he was difficult, he knew his stuff inside and out. So if you're gonna be difficult, at least be good at what you do. If you can be good at it and also be amiable, that's better.
I think amiability is really important because you can not be brilliant. I mean, Michael was brilliant.
He was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and not all of us are going to be brilliant like Michael, but you can still work. And you can work by being really great people to be around. Again, I go back to Jim and Ernie. They were just really cool people to have in the room. They made my life fun because they were fun people to have around. And, you know, they were able to learn their craft during the course of working on shows like Spider-Man.
And when you're on a hot deadline, I mean, when I was doing Dinosaurs, I had to turn in 3 final scripts every Wednesday. I did 65 half hours in 3 months, which I think is still a world record. And in that situation, if I can have someone brilliant and difficult, or I can have someone good and easy, I know which one I'm going to choose, and it's not going to be the pain in my butt. It's not.
Let me, I have a couple of things to say here. First of all, this panel is supposed to end in a few minutes. It's not going to. We're just going to keep going here because I'm the next panel, and I can go as long as I want. I can't stop me. We will segue to the topic of Hanna-Barbera for those of you who want to hear more about Hanna-Barbera soon. But we're going to keep going. This has become a 2-hour panel retroactively. If you have to leave to go to another panel, we'll understand. We won't be offended, but we're going to take a lot of questions in a minute. Now, second topic, I disagree.
The show running as hell?
Well, okay, first of all, I disagree. I've been in good writers' rooms. I've worked in good writers' rooms, and working in bad writers' rooms to me is just as bad as working on your own for an idiot producer.
Oh, sure.
Okay, I don't find anything. I don't find a huge difference there. I was for a while involved with Cheers. And that writer's room was smart and brilliant, and they were surrounded by good people, funny people with ideas, and that show would not have been as good as it was without the amalgam of talent there. And I worked in writers' rooms where, you know, it was every man or woman for themselves, and everyone was fighting, and I worked in one time where I think I was the only person who was not interrupting the script to use cocaine. So it varies. You have good situations and bad situations, and you have to rise to the occasion in the bad situations. About show running, I will tell you here that the years I spent doing the Garfield and Friends show were absolutely every writer's dream of how we'll do the show. Here's how we did the show. Jim Davis, Warren Garfield, and Howard Davis said to the network, just leave Mark alone, he can do whatever he wants. And Jim said to me, just do whatever you want. And I just wrote the scripts, we recorded them, we put them into animation. Later on, then I could read them. They had no script approval whatsoever. And I wrote whatever I wanted. I didn't have to fight with the voice director because I was the voice director. And the show was CBS's #1 show for 7 years. So.
And good luck trying to get that gig.
Well, listen, there is nothing stopping somebody who owns a valuable property from saying, I will do this, I will give you the rights to do a cartoon of my character if you hire John Semper or leave him alone, or Paul Dini or Brynne or anything like that. It starts someplace up there with the person who has the power to make the show happen at all. And you have sometimes you'll have I worked on a lot of deep shows waiting for the time I could do a show I wanted. And there's nothing worse than writing on a geek show, believe me. Anyway, and there was something else you disagreed with, but I agree generally with the principle here, especially the part about getting along with people. One of the things you need to learn in this business, you know, you will write something at some point that you're doing right, you're doing it very fine, and you've got a great show set in the future. And some network executive or producer will turn to you and say, what if we set this in the Civil War?
Yeah.
And then what you have to do is learn to say, now that's an interesting concept, let's think that out of it. And you have to be able to say your idea is stupid without saying your idea is stupid. You have to consider them. And you know, once in a while, that idea in left field, it sounds stupid when somebody first says it, enriches something. I work with producers and executives who write 2 times less a day than a stock clock. sometimes you can find those great situations. Now, anybody heard a question? Anybody have something? Right there, okay. Those two people in a row, okay. First person here, right? You can still hear, you can yell if you want to.
There's a microphone right there.
Yeah,
Whatever you like.
maybe check.
Yeah.
I've sat on several of the panels before, but something I've always wanted to ask, you guys have been in animation so long, you must have something cool. What are the coolest pieces of animation you can collect?
You mean like collectibles?
Yeah, like do you have the signed by Drew Foray or an original sketch by Jim Davis?
I have original sketches. I've got a Garfield script that he drew with my name in it. Yeah, I've got things like that. You know what the valuable thing we have is not tangible properties. You know, in this business, I got to direct Jaws Butler and Mel Blanc. There's no tangible thing that could ever mean as much to me as that.
My daughter used to use the Dungeons and Dragons storyboards. That's what she had for coloring books. And she was But the coolest thing for me is not anything tangible. On Gargoyles, I wanted Tim Curry to come and be on the show so I could meet Tim Curry. Yeah. So I wrote Dr. Severius for him, and Tim in person is very sweet and very shy, very warm, and he likes to talk about his roses, but when he was in the recording session, I had quite deliberately put the word creature into the script, and when he came to it, doing the voice, he looked right at me and said it as Frankenfurter. And I fainted, and I stand by my reaction.
Let's get another question. Thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry if I'm looking at my phone, but I've just been pulled into a group chat about war plans. Very strange. Okay. All right.
Hi, this one's for Brynne. How do you sell a story with complex themes to, say, Disney or a cartoon of any kind?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
How do you sell a story or a script regarding complex themes? And you talk about Gargoyles and how the stories kind of overarch the entire season, but a lot of times in terms of Hanna-Barbera, it doesn't happen.
It depends on who the story is, who the studio is. I have never worked for either Ruby Spears or Hanna-Barbera because my golf Reeves, the late Michael Reeves, got into screaming matches with both Joe Ruby and either Hanna-Barbera, I don't remember, and so they wouldn't hire him anymore, and then they didn't hire me either because I was his wife. Anytime, I think that all good writers try to take anything they're working on to the next level. So if you're freelancing, you just have to know how to pitch it, and if you have to kind of sneak the complexities in later, if you're a good writer, you can do that. But usually, there's a whole process. It's springboard, premise, outline, rewrite, script, rewrite. And if you're working on a team who values writing, those stories are going to come out. And in a spec script, you want to go a little bit heavier on that because they don't want to see what their show is doing alone. They want to see what it is doing, but also what it could do. So you have to go a little bit farther. Thank you.
The last gentleman in line, you're the last person in line. Don't let anybody get behind you. Okay, next question.